So Ken, it's really good to be with you. We had a brief conversation at the Baptist Union Council recently in terms of women in ministry and encouraging all aspects of women in leadership. And as you know, I've just recently been appointed to the Baptist Union as its Centenary Development Enabler, so with a real focus on encouraging women. Ken, I'm aware that your theme for your presidential this year as our Baptist Union President for our Baptist family has been all about where do we grow from here. I think it's a brilliant theme, and I would love to hear how this connects with women in ministry and leadership.
Thank you, Jane. Great to have you here in our church. It absolutely does fit that theme. If we're going to ask the question, where do we grow from here, then part of the answer surely must be to fully include the full range of gifts that God has given the church. And if we look at that, then we need to say that half of the gifts, perhaps a little bit more than half of the gifts, if we look at the proportion of men and women in our churches, is with gifted and enabled, very gifted women in our churches. And so unless we fully utilise those range of gifts, we'll never fully get to answer the question, where do we grow from here? Our denomination has a good history, but it's travelled pretty slow ever since. I think we're a bit like the hare in the tortoise and the hare race. We set off really fast 100 years ago, hence your centenary appointment, recognising some brave initial women in ministry. But then it was almost as though we felt the race was done and we fell asleep under a tree, and some others have gone ahead of us. Not that we're racing against them, but they set a benchmark for us, I think. So I think it's absolutely key.
Sure, I think you're right, Ken, and it's been one of my observations as I've, just travelled around the country. I've just been surprised that we're just moving really slow with this agenda, and particularly when we compare ourselves, not that it's a race, but in terms of other denominations, we are way behind. So moving at a really slow pace. So I'm interested, Ken, with your theme as well. I know that if we dig deeper with this, part of it is about whole life discipleship and the kind of sacred secular divide. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, so that again very much relates to wanting to promote women in all aspects of ministry and leadership when they might not promote themselves very often. As soon as one begins to promote the idea, which I do, that there isn't so much of a sacred secular divide, that all roles are spiritual if they are done by Christians for God, then one begins to look at the other roles that women do extremely capably in the rest of society. So I know that this wouldn't be received well in large places in areas in the world, for example, at the moment. But I would want to say, as somebody from Asian roots, predominantly from Sri Lanka, to my Sri Lankan friends and relatives, for example, that we had the first democratically elected head of state in the world in Bandaranaike in 1960, I think. And I'd want to say to my Indian friends that they had the second democratically elected woman head of state in Indira Gandhi in 66, I think. And I know that neither of those people particularly shared our faith. That's not really the point. Surely we would have thought it even better if they had shared our faith. So if we can see a role for women and even celebrate a role for women with all of the leadership responsibilities and areas to cover in a head of state type role, then how come, and we see such a small distinction between sacred and secular, how can we not also promote women in all aspects of church leadership? Our churches are full of women in incredibly responsible jobs outside of the church. As soon as we recognise that they're also spiritual jobs, then we should be able to promote them in all aspects of church ministry, I think. Even though they might not put themselves forward necessarily, talking in broad generalisations, nevertheless we need to look for ways to encourage them to come forward, I would say.
Sure, I think that's really important, Ken. And again, as I've listened to many women across the country in our Baptist family, I'm still hearing that they're not given the opportunity, for example, to lead, to step into leadership, or there's assumptions made about what types of roles they might fulfil in church, for example. So anything that can encourage them has got to be, brilliant. And again, in terms of, well, let's talk about biblical texts for a moment. I'm aware that this is still a sticky topic for some people even today.
Yes.
I met somebody just recently who wouldn't encourage women because of his view of the Bible.
Yes.
How do we kind of handle this, Ken?
Yeah, I mean, we've rightly started with my theme. Thank you for doing that. But obviously, theologically, our starting point comes from our understanding of the Bible, and for me too. And the minimum I would want my friends who hold a different view to understand is that I hold a high view of Scripture, and that my understanding comes from that place. I guess predominantly the easiest way to understand it for me is that I see an overwhelmingly clear direction of travel in Scripture back towards a position of equality, which is to say that from the fall onwards in the Bible, there is a direction of travel back towards a position of greater equality, including gender equality. So if one takes a snapshot at any one point in the Bible, one sees great inequality between the genders, but that isn't necessarily what's being promoted. What's being promoted is a journey, and that journey steps up incredibly fast with Jesus, of course, who goes out of his way to include and enable women. So I'm aware of, we all are, the controversial passages that seem to limit the role for women in leadership, passages that talk about headship or about silence.
Yeah.
My own view is that predominantly those who hold a different view, they perhaps misunderstand the direct understanding of those words for silence and headship, but they also misunderstand the direction of travel that there is in those, in overwhelmingly in Scripture, such that one can't help oneself, like taking a snapshot of a runner. They could not yet be at the finish line, but if they're just before the finish line, you know where the picture's going to go. They're going to end up beyond the finish line. That's how I read Scripture. I do think Junior, for example, is most clearly a woman, and that's the most direct way of translating that role of apostle that she has in Scripture. So I'd want to argue each individual passage in that way. But for me, what becomes most clear is that there's a dominant theme back towards a place of equality, and I read the other passages in the light of that. So I guess to go back to where we started, the where do we grow from here theme, we won't grow from here until we fully use the gifts that God has given the church, and that requires people like me who are in a position of privilege.
Sure.
I'm a male minister who's given more opportunities, who's asked to do more things currently. It requires people like me to be willing to step up and have a conversation like this, so delighted to be able to do so, but also willing to step back and give more space to brilliant, gifted women who might not even recognise that in themselves, and even when they do recognise it in themselves, might not be given the opportunities to. And unless we give those opportunities, then we all lose.
Sure. Thanks, Ken. It's been a delight to hear from you, and we wish you well too in your own direction of travel as you journey on with a new role later this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Thank you.